forever, and I'm excited to talk about National Poetry Month, especially on Earth Day. And again, thank you for my former students. It's great to see you, to have you here. As many of you know, I've been teaching poetry writing for over 30 years, and I've been writing it even longer. And poetry is an ancient art form. It's founded on a relationship with words. And while poetry is often viewed as an emotional expression, I teach my students, and I do the same thing. I treat each word as if it is a note of music with its own connotations, sound, and origination. And it is through the arrangement of words that in a poem that emotions are expressed. So the title of this presentation, Vespers in the Great Basin, is the subtitle of a section of one of my manuscripts that has a series of poems about the landscape in this area. And it connects two focuses of my poetry, writing about place and creating images through language. As my students are aware, every word has connotations and associations. And when you read someone's poem, you bring your experiences to the poem because of your associations with the words. The reading of a poem creates a shared space in the mind of two imaginations, the poet and the reader, and that space is shaped by language. So because I like to know the history of words, and because this is Earth Day, I wanted to give us a little bit of background about the word landscape. So I'm going to go ahead and share this piece. It's from one of the presentations that I've done on symbolic landscapes. So what is the meaning of the word landscape? It is a picture that represents natural inland scenery. And it is also refers to land, as in solid land, ground, soil, but it has two other meanings as well. It has a meaning of enclosure from the Welsh word enclosure, and also from the sense of open space, from the idea of open space as well as enclosure. So it has these two combinations of meanings in that word. The word scape comes from an earlier word, skeep, to shape, create, ordain, or appoint, to shape, outline, or organize, or give form to. So you have this land that's open and closed at the same time, and it's connected to the word to shape or ordain. And as I began to consider the concept of scape from the word landscape, I thought about to ordain is to confer holy orders upon, to consecrate, to venerate, to create a sanctuary or holy ground. And so when we think of landscape, we are setting aside space and giving it form. We are creating space and making it holy. It becomes sacred through our designations. And as I begin to consider this, and I know from my own experience, landscapes can haunt us if we leave them behind. They become emblematic of a lost home. But there's also this quote from a writer named Simon Schama from a book that he wrote called Memory and Landscape. And if we face a landscape every day, their shape becomes integrated into ourselves. When we remember landscape, this is from Schama, the scenery is built up as much from strata of memory as from layers of rock. So those two concepts are what I am considering or looking at when I'm thinking about these poems, layers of memory or strata of memory, and then layers of the landscape here. So I'm going to return now to the title of this talk, Vespers in the Great Basin. The word Vesper originally meant evening star from the Old French word meaning evening or nightfall. It also comes from the Old French meaning evensong. And within its roots is the idea of the setting sun and also the word west. And it's related to the Latin word vespera, or the canonical evensongs. So going back to its first meaning, evening star, Vesper also implies Venus, both the planet and the Roman goddess, who is derivative of the Greek goddess Aphrodite. So in that one word, Vespers, there are a myriad of roots and branches, which is why poetry can be so powerful. So how do we write about place related to our sensory experiences, which is sight, touch, sound, smell, and yet we're using the abstract power of words. And the key is through the creation of images using words that evoke the five senses. So I want you to think about your own place here. Think about what you know of this in terms of this landscape that's part of the Great Basin. And consider this question for a moment. What sensory memories do you have of seeing at twilight the planet Venus in the western sky against the landscape of Three Peaks? What specific words would you use to describe that scene? And if you can't, if it's not Three Peaks, just think about the twilight in this area, anytime that twilight, that beautiful time of the evening, what would you think about? And if you may be thinking peaceful, quiet, maybe thinking lonely, but those words still don't evoke the senses. So you would take it a step further. What is the season? Where are you located? Are you on a walk in the front porch or in your car listening to the radio? And if you were to drive past Three Peaks on Highway 56, what does the twilight look like when you leave the lights of Cedar City behind and you start to drive up toward the summit? Is it a late summer night or a cold early evening? Whenever you see the sky at different times of the evening or different seasons, it has its own connotation. Maybe that's the word I'd like to use, or association. So my writing about place comes from my own personal experience of having lived in one place from my childhood and young adult life and moving to a very different location. So my first poems, when I began to write after moving here, they were rooted in the landscape and the sensory details of the South in Virginia. So they were written from layers of memory or strata of memory. And when I moved here to Southern Utah, I began to use other images to describe this landscape as I experienced it, because the layers of time are so apparent here when you begin to look at the red rock and the other aspects of landscape. So I'm going to now start to read some of the poems that describe my journey through images of place. And when I began to choose these poems for this presentation, I noticed a pattern of the images, which is why I chose a title coming from that manuscript, Vespers in the Great Basin. There are images of the seashore and the desert. There's the idea of arrival, departure. There are ancient remnants of the Permian seas. And in particular, there is the notion of the night, the twilight, the planet Venus in different ways. And many of these poems do consider the idea of the night or the evening. But I'm going to start off with this first poem, and it's kind of a primordial beginning. In other words, it describes not just not my beginning, obviously, but a sense of an ancient beginning. And it was first published as a broadside through the Salt Front Journal. And a broadside is a poster of a poem with an image. And the image that was used was the image of an ammonite. And so ancient shell form. And the poem itself is called Retrieval. Air in the empty chambers of the ammonite gives it buoyancy for swimming until it settles in sediment as the Kaibab Sea shrinks from the Great Basin that is so deep, its rocks and shells will never reach the ocean. The ocean will have to come to them, pouring over the rim when the west coast sinks into depths that flood the Mojave. Creatures embedded in limestone will taste this new salt, abrading their locked beds, giving them a trail to follow home. So that poem I wrote after some time of being here and seeing the different landscapes being struck by living on the shores of an invisible sea that creates this landscape and the evidence that is left behind. And you'll kind of see that theme in some of these other poems. In this poem, I go back to the start of my own journey in my childhood home in the South, and the title Provenance means place of origin. Provenance. Small suitcase in hand, my runaway notes spelled out on the kitchen table. I reached the top of the cul-de-sac to see rooftops, telephone poles, daffodils, fading crocuses, and lawn after green lawn toward a tarmac horizon. What did I hope to find at 5? Twilight lengthens toward the place I will become. But here, I wait on the curb in a pulse of fireflies, beyond my mother's low tones in the kitchen, before notes pound into a thunderstorm, drowning the peonies. And my sister grabs my hand to snip blossoms, float them in glass bowls, while rain plinks on the roof through hairline cracks in the rows of pans that line the hallway. Our mother shuffles a deck into solitaire, My sister, 10, laughs at my red suitcase soaked on the porch when we open the door to the darkened sky. The drive empty of our father's Dodge Dart, not yet home. Rain falling on spruce, tarmac, honeysuckle, into a world I can't yet see. So that's a poem that is reminiscent of the place I came from. But this next poem, it's related to the first one. There is the idea of departure, of leaving one place behind, but seeing the traces of an old place in the imagery of the new location. When I first moved to Cedar City, I lived in a small house on 200 North, but I would walk through the neighborhoods in the older part of town near the university. And this would have actually been even before the Institute building was built, before the Shakespeare Center, and before the raising of one of the oldest LDS churches in town that's in the intersection of 200 South and 200 West. So the neighborhoods that I remembered at that time connected seamlessly with each other. Every town evolves and changes over time, and this poem captures an earlier time and also captures a sense of some of the first neighbors I met. These are older women who had lived in Cedar City for most of their lives, most of whom are gone now. So the poem is called Leaving Virginia, and there are layers of images of past and present. Utah houses soften their angles at dusk. Hollyhocks blend with the larkspur. Women disappear behind graciousness, a smile that tells nothing. Their shadows stretch in the twilight that darkens a kitchen window. They sweep out corners holding the wand of a broom. Sand skims a patio beneath a mirage of white dogwood petals. I seem on the edge of everything. The Mojave spread out west beyond the grid streets of a Mormon town. My first night in the desert, stars I had only glimpsed through a humid gaze, now glitter bright as ice. So that gives you a sense of this past and this present place, or at least the early impressions I had of this place. So those three poems, they create a connection to the place, but this next poem takes on the idea of journey, drawing on the myth of Venus. And so I use one term in the poem, Nomen, which is the projecting piece of a sundial that shows time by the position of its shadow. It also refers to a sundial shell, which is a specific type of spiraled shell, and it refers to that. And then it also refers to St. James, one of the patron saints of pilgrims, and his symbol is a scallop shell. So the myth of Venus, you've probably seen the famous Botticelli painting of Venus arriving on the shore on a half shell, so to speak. And there's some reference of this notion of the shell and arrival. And it's called She Carries a Sundial Shell. She carries a sundial shell in her hand, its tip a gnomon. Libra's scales follow the day's journey on a sundial. The scales deride from the scallop Venus rode to the strand, the only shell that crosses oceans, clapping two valves through spume, 100 eyes on its rim. St. James fell into the sea and was buoyed by their mouths clinging to his clothes. The scallop-shaped scar on her cheek is a pilgrim sign, as if all her days were held in one moment she glimpsed at the corner of her young eyes while collecting shells. Her own life's helix curls into a carapace to land at this morning. So that poem has a variety of images that are sort of layered and transform as the poem continues. This next poem it is titled Venus, and it is a more modern version, as you will see. My grandmother watched one blue afternoon, huge waves roll toward rocks in Monterey Bay, lunge over the 40-foot seawall, break at beds of ice plant, the surge flooding the road, spray striking her window in the cottage she bought when Cannery Row was still a cannery. A few hours later, police stopped to tell her an earthquake hit Alaska and sent a tsunami to Pacific Grove. She never got word it was too dangerous to stay. 50 years later, on my walk along the seawall, clouds brood over black water, splashing rocks where boat lights plumb the surface below the cliff, and otters sway in their sleep on kelp beds. She said it was the most beautiful thing she had seen, a wave traveling for miles to break shells at her doorstep. So 2 poems that are of different notions of place and the idea of Venus. So I'll read these next 3 poems in a sequence as I give different aspects of this desert landscape. And having read the earlier poems, you'll kind of see that I grew up going to the, near the ocean, at least going to the ocean when we could. So the sea images still show up at different places in these poems. And I'm just going to read them in a sequence without explanation. Great Basin. I am no nearer to what the sea tries to loosen, wedged in rock, a sorrow slipped between a trapped metal cap and glass shattered along another coast. The truth is, I don't live near the ocean, but in a desert town I refuse to see, built on an alluvial fan of gypsum soil shifting beneath cracked plaster and skewed door frames, beneath miles of silver sage, rabbit brush, dry lakes, and wind trembling through pinyon rooted along the highway. I leave my own trace, planting wisteria, honeysuckle, southern foreigners thirsting for water. I blink and the town is gone, drowned in a sea of fossils. What that sea left behind is the desert I walk through, a sorrow slipped between trilobites and shale. Now, I said I would not talk about these poems, but actually I will talk about this next one because this is a poem about, in the wintertime, there's a certain ranch that's, I can't remember which, I think it's the Minersville Highway that it's on, that you go out and you can see eagles at night in about January and February. We used to go out and watch them come in and travel. And as I saw this image, as I went out to see them, I began to see an image of these 2 people kind of responding to that, but and then driving home. And that's what this poem is about. And this is a title poem for this the presentation. Vespers in the Great Basin. Bald eagles gather among the elms with soft whistles as they glide over snowfields of thistle and jackrabbits, settle on branches, umber wings folded against their bodies, albino heads tucked from the wind. Each winter, we watch them fly across the valley to this empty ranch, stretch their wingspan beyond 6 feet, their darkness growing in sunset until Venus appears in the west. Driving home, your right hand fumbles with my fingers as if with a rosary, while your left keeps the wheel in check. Out the window, I see a brown quarter horse lean against a fence in snow, haunches turned to the wind. We meet the coldness that blows in through door jambs, the chimney. Next January, when mountain peaks glisten beneath miters of ice, we'll return to elms as eagles gather across the river and the Riven Valley. They'll hunch together on racked branches of winter trees, still believing they can keep the cold at bay. And this 3rd poem is one that I wrote after being here for some time, and the landscape was beginning to unfold and to present itself, I guess, in a way that I was able to appreciate it without having that sense of loss for the previous landscape that I had been from. This is called Winter Solstice in the Gorge. Our myths turn long nights into cut evergreen on grocery store parking lots, a continent away from reindeer starving as the Arctic ice dissolves. Only one star guides the way for diesels lit like Christmas, miles of commerce that thread the Mojave. The longest night spills from a cup of tears I drink through this highway that weaves between monoliths of an American Stonehenge along the Virgin River's winding course. At the hour's cusp, I see her face in the rock, Freya, who carries the sun in antlers. She spins a wheel around our breath, seeds the earth with bits of amber. At dawn, the sun stands still on a plateau of kaibab sediment, reaches its rays down gypsum layers, touches sandstone near bighorn sheep who step out of shadow. So those three poems give you kind of a sense of different aspects of landscape. And I'm just going to take a short break, a stop here to explain a little bit about poetry, Earth Day, and that connection. I just finished a panel on earlier of the weekend that was part of the Utah Poetry Festival. And one of the questions that was asked is if you're writing eco-poetry, if you're writing about the environment, and that was the panel I was on, was writing about the environment, is it a political thing? Or is it an artistic thing? And I think I talked about poets being poetry of witness. But if you're going to write about place, part of what may begin to happen is writing about place that changes even as you see it, changing because of climate, changing because of a variety of things. And part of what we do when we are writing about a place is preserving it. We're keeping it. We're trying to find a way to have it be as we remembered it, the way that we connected to it. So I'll finish up with the last set of these poems, and these next two are short poems, but they show again that layering of memory of the place in the past, and then or this next poem does, and then I'll finish up with just a few more poems. So Desert Insomnia relates again to the Virgin River Gorge and has the image again of the night. Desert Insomnia. Truckers roar southbound past harbors of lights. Who lives in these towns, they think, before fading into the Virgin River Gorge, headlights scanning crags for bighorn sheep. They mark their time by bluffs outlined in the dark and shell stations. I listen at midnight to the distant whine from my front porch, where a cloud sits on its haunches over a plain of stars. All summer, the child next door clicks and chatters grace notes to the cricket's calls. Her days filled with faces she can't decipher, colors and noises that set her mind spinning. But on some nights, she echoes the music she hears. Insects humming, push of sprinklers, highway engines. I rock myself to sleep to her chimes. And then Old Haunts. Cicadas trill outside my open window, but it's only crickets rubbing their legs in the Utah night. Their song tricks me back down the path across the stream to McIntyre Park, where high school friends take their children on the 4th of July. Small hands wave sparklers over blankets, and magnesium burns slowly above a child's wrist into emptied KFC buckets, while red, copper, blue fireworks flash with a boom, then whistle into sulfur and ash. I stand at the cul-de-sac of my old house, where the blue spruce stretches its shadow over the groove my bike once wore in the grass, and watch new owners set the dining room table, then switch on lamps to play a record that spins vibrato through the walls before I fall back to sleep this side of the Continental Divide. So I just have 3 more poems to read. And as I finish these up, the next one is more about not so much landscape, but about one of the first houses that my husband and I lived in when we first were here. And it was a 100-year-old house. And so it had, of course, several characteristics about it that we did not notice because we were so charmed by the house itself. So it's a little bit about that, but it's also about the layered time of this place and what it feels like to be in a place that has so much history from earlier generations as well, and kind of beginning to connect to that again after having written about the places that I was from. So I'm going to take a quick drink of water before I finish up with these last 3 poems, and then we will have time for questions and discussion. And some of you may know the person that I write about in this poem. If you are, you may have some relationship to that. And as always, whenever you're writing poetry, you start with something, but you create something else out of it. And so it's both what is actually there, but what you have brought to it as well. The glazier. All through the Depression, he worked in the barn, surrounded by glass shards from panes he sanded and pressed into wooden frames for neighbors who brought him their broken things. His thick gloved fingers scraped putty into grooves, carefully fit sharp edges into place, then brushed the wood with lead paint to let dry near the boiler he would fire. A large furnace on the barn's gravel floor we were too afraid to start up after buying the house 60 years later from the realtor whose chatter distracted us from cracked plaster, uneven walls. One night, the nameless stray who lived in the loft slid through a tear in the screen to our bedroom at 3 a.m. Our legs sprawled, sheets shoved away for the heat, and lunged onto my husband's thigh, kneading her claws into his skin. I moaned in my half-dream of an alien creature howling through our open window. She dug in deeper and he yowled, tried to kick her off as she lithely jumped down, scrambled out. We couldn't stop laughing, didn't sleep for the rest of the night, but talked until dawn when lilacs wafted through the screen on a morning breeze and our dog nudged to be let out to the yard of our first garden, freshly planted rose bushes, old maple trees that would shade the swing set. The stray slept in the barn for years until she disappeared one winter when we rattled the food bag in snow, called the name we finally gave her, returned to the bedroom, finally knowing what we had lost. I still find glints poking through soil hard-packed by a century of footsteps. Sometimes I think I see him too beneath rafters, cutting and beveling to feel transparent weight in his hands. Finally, these last two poems are more recent. I wrote the first one a year ago after I broke my ankle on Christmas Eve and was basically confined downstairs. When I was finally mobile, the lockdown hit, and I didn't realize that what I had written about, even though it seemed very simple, as it turned out, was about something that was rare, that we really couldn't do during this last year when the lockdown happened. So this is called Flight Path. The view from my front porch is a white stucco house, its dark dining room, windows backlit, and a blue half moon of television glow. Cottonwoods and spruce stand above the roof so high they block the sunset as hawks circle from fields to roost in branches. I imagine that I fly beyond the trees, over a hill of mansions, a dry lake, and valley of sagebrush, until I clear the dormant volcanoes of Three Peaks, cross the border where I follow Basin and Range, Sierra Nevada, Great Valley, toward the dark Pacific. But now the porch light flares across the street. A man says goodbye to the neighbors, thanks them for dinner, and opens his car door. As they close and latch theirs, flick off switches, leave the one to shine. And finally, this last poem is a kind of response to the first one, Retrieval, about the very ancient shells, the very ancient sea. And even though this was written much more recently, and it closes the journey that I have described in these poems. It's called Even Song. Sunbeams scatter through oxygen and nitrogen, bending frequencies into a band of blue, gray, and white, swallowed by waves of nautical twilight. The moment Venus appears next to Algol, the demon star, and Lambda, astral boat lights floating on a January horizon. I fly over arteries of lights in a Brasilia, tilt to one side along the Buckhorn Flats. Home is scattered, red cliffs to the east, a dry basin to the west, and in between, the town of 3 exits where I have lived out the same day for 30 years. A glossy magazine promises vacations to Denmark, Bali, Alaska, where oceans beat the shores with breakers from our first breaths before our lidless eyes could no longer see through water. At a wind gap, symbols on rock tell of the equinox, tell of rain, a journey, a woman giving birth. Flat clouds signal a storm building in Nevada that will reach us by tomorrow night. But this evening, wind blowing across sandstone reminds me how long I've been held by this land, unable to swim away through invisible seas. So thank you for, again, asking me to do this presentation. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. That was excellent, and your poetry is so fun, especially as it is reminiscent of our areas and it creates images in our minds. What questions or comments do any of you have that you'd like Danielle to address?
Yeah, any questions you have about poetry in general? Again, writing poems about place and how we connect to place. Anything you're wondering about?
I just wanted to ask how it must have been interesting for you to put together the poems sort of historically from when you moved to Cedar City. How, as you reflected on that, what's your overall take on just how you've developed and how your poetry has obviously developed as well? It's beautiful, by the way. Wonderful, wonderful to share. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. That's a very good question, because I would say that the process sort of happened unawares, like it happened without me realizing it. Pretty soon, I'm drawn to places here that I couldn't see when I first moved here. And so the volcanoes, the dormant volcanoes, and just different aspects of being just like 56 driving to Burl. It's just like, it can feel like exotic to come over that hill and see like the more like suddenly it just has a different connection to me than at a sunset that it might have otherwise. When I first moved here, I'd mentioned to someone, I want to go to Newcastle. It sounds like so exciting. And they said, sure, go ahead. go to Newcastle. And so it just, there's just different aspects of things that begin, that when you first move, things sort of open up, and then they open up even more. But it was a process, and I began to realize that the images, I was sort of drawn to them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you've captured them beautifully. Like, as Ron said, it helps us all appreciate our place as well.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, thank you. I don't think your realtor will ever use my poems to advertise anything. It's like every house we've had. It's like,
Absolutely.
So, but that's also part of that, the older homes and that kind of thing as well. But thanks for that question. Any other questions? Anything else that you're thinking about with the places you come from? What, the images you carry with those from those places?
Questions or comments?
You might not be able to hear, I don't want to get too much feedback, but Danielle, I think growing up in the West, we think of the East having so much more time than we have, because you can see the colonialism around you. You can see cities that have been there since the 1600s, and then everything's kind of new here.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to see your concept of how ancient it is out here. And so when you came here, do you think that your concept of time kind of shifted because of growing up used to kind of older things and coming to at least the man-made things here, other than things from indigenous people are new?
Right.
Coming from a place where everything's older, did that have an effect on how you view your art and how you express time through your poetry?
Yeah, I think it did, because I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's where the University of Virginia is, and there's Monticello, and there's the Thomas Jefferson never died, as far as they're concerned. He's still revered, although it's so much more complicated, as you know, if you've seen anything with what happened in Charlottesville the last years, about 3 years ago, I think. It is a very complicated place. So in a way, Charlottesville is reconciling with their past. They are having to reconcile with what happened with in terms of enslaved people, what the South meant, how that developed. So that past was there, but it was there in couched terms. So I would go to Monticello on a school trip. We would never hear about the enslaved people. We would never hear about that background. And now that is becoming part of the archaeological sites for Monticello. So the history was there, but the history was a slanted history. And yet it was, and so I grew up with a sense of, feeling very much connected to that central Virginia, Shenandoah Valley, Blue Ridge Mountains, and not knowing that they were older. That's the older place really than what the West has, even geologically. But and you do have a sense of history. You go to the Smithsonian, and that sense of history is there. So it's more of a history of people than it is a history of place. And I think coming here, because I don't have, when I walk down Main Street, I do not have any childhood connection to this town. I can't, obviously I don't. We don't when we move to a new place. And yet there are people that do. And so this is a town that has, many of the people who've grown up here are here. And so they have those connotations. And I think that for me, then it was landscape that I would connect to more than even the history of a place, because that was what I could, that's where I could, that's just what I felt like I'd lost where I was and could connect to here. But going back to that historical sense of it, the history of the people is what I would have grown up around. And in DC, going there, you feel that as well. So it's a different situation. But I've had students who have written about their places where they grew up and some generational connections through their poetry, and such richness that they have brought. I mean, Brock, I'm thinking of your lyric sequence. I'm thinking of other people's poetry as well that I remember writing about when they've written about place and how they've unpacked that place for them and the people they connect to that place. The more that I think about our connections to place, often it's because of the people we're with that we have that connection to it.
Danielle, one question that was in the chat is from Scott Church, a former student of yours, and he thanks you for the inspiring poetry. But his question is, what parts of your poems do you find yourself revisiting the most as you work through them?
That's okay, good question. When I'm writing about landscape here, I do research about what is here, like the vegetation, the rocks. I do want to make sure that it is accurate. And I need to give a shout out to the geology professors here, because Robert Eves, before he retired, he was my consultant at times. Johnny McLean is now my poetry consultant. And so I'll send him an email like, okay, how do I define this in the land? So I go back and revisit those moments as well. But I also revisit lines for music, for sound. And so they do need to sound a certain way, more than say something. They need to say things, but I go back and I read them for how they sound, and then I arrange the lines in a way that works with the imagery that I'm trying to convey. So I'll just take a case in point, the poem Winter Solstice in the Gorge. This is why poetry doesn't ever pay anything. I spent a day working on 2 lines in that poem. I mean, a day trying to figure out that last part with the kaibab and with the seeing the goddess Freya in the rock and going through. I just spent trying to get it so that it would just be what I wanted to be with those images. So it can be any number of things that I go back to listen and tweak it and sharpen it so that it has that look. And The Glacier was another poem that I went back many times to get all of those images the way that I want them to both be seen and to be heard. So it just depends on what sounds off at the beginning as I'm reading it, and then go back and shape it again.
Danielle, maybe just to close, share with us the importance of poetry in general for society and the importance of National Poetry Month, and maybe that'll be a way for us to end.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, because one of the questions that I asked my students this fall, I said, why poetry? Why do we do this? And I mentioned at the very beginning, poetry is an ancient art form. Some people think poetry is a riddle that needs to be solved. Some people think that it's and some people don't read more than say the poems that they encountered in elementary school, or they think poems should rhyme. When I think about our own poetry education, some of us, and it's not through anybody's fault, but if a teacher isn't comfortable teaching poetry, the extent of your education might be similar to if like I'm just going to use music as a metaphor. If all you ever heard growing up was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, then you walk into a symphony, what are you going to do? You're going to be blown away. You didn't even know that was out there. You didn't even know that music existed. And I think sometimes with poetry, if we didn't have a very good, positive education with it, we feel like it shuts us out. It's not there. But poetry is in all of us. Our heartbeat, the way that our bodies move, the way we listen to things, it is so old and ancient art form. It is a part of us. So when I think, what can we, why poetry? Why do we still study it and read it? It taps into your senses. It taps into your imagination, which is a really important part of yourself. It is important for you to daydream, to speculate, to imagine, and to see things and to connect the things in a way that's beyond just what seems, sort of in front of you. So National Poetry Month is a way to remind us that in a world that seems very, not so fast-paced now because of the pandemic, but in a world that doesn't always, I would say, value the arts unless they kind of bring value. And poetry might seem to be the most useless of all the arts out there, and it really isn't. It is powerful. And as my students, when I'm teaching them in the classroom, one of the things that I love when I read their poems when they've also created a series of poems, I see a world unfold. I see just an entire imagination unfold before me. And that is an amazing experience. And then another aspect about poetry is it creates community. So our poems, the poems of a community, represent or reflect what is happening. And right now there are a lot of poems that are being written about contemporary things, even this whole last year, about what's been going on. Poetry is a way to tap into our emotional self, but it's also a way to sharpen our connection to language. So it's so layered, nuanced, incredible, beautiful, and it's not an art form that you should ever feel you're locked out of. It is as much of your art form as it is anybody else's. And finally, when I consider, poets will tell you how to read their poem. And so if the poet doesn't care if you understand their poem, they're not going to show it to you. Then what you do is you appreciate their language. If they walk you through it, my poems are pretty clear. I'm not trying to push you out of the poem. In these poems, I'm not. That means that the poet has invited you in. But the poet is the one who kind of lets that door open or close. It's not you, the reader. If you read a poem and you feel shut out, the poet maybe they don't want you there. Maybe they don't care whether you read their poem or not. And then you read it on your terms and you appreciate what they were doing with their imagination, with words at that time. That's how I would answer that question. Why poetry?
Well, thank you very much, Danielle, and we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule, and especially with finals next week. So thank you very much.
Again, I appreciate you asking me, Ron, for this.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, everyone.